Hello, my name is Justine Hollingshead. Today we're going to be talking about human factors. The learning outcomes include identifying common human factors and errors, describing ways to combat errors, identifying the types of spatial disorientation and visual orientation illusions, and applying methods to prevent disorientation. The FAA has what we call the dirty dozen. As you read through these errors and listen to each one as we talk about them here in a few minutes, it's easy to see their relationship in all aspects of aviation, including uncrewed aircraft. The FAA safety team document on the dirty dozen common causes of human factors tells us that 80% of maintenance mistakes involve human factors, and if not detected, will lead to an accident. So we're going to review each one of these dirty dozen items and share ways that you can improve for each one. So let's get started. Number one, lack of communication. So this is failure to transmit, receive, or provide enough information to complete a task. We don't want you ever to assume anything. And to realize only 30% of verbal communication is received and understood by either side in a conversation. That's pretty low. Others usually remember the first and last part of what you say. So to combat a lack of communication and to improve your communication, say the most important things in the beginning and repeat them at the end, and use checklists. This will be the first time you hear that, but it won't be the last. Number two, complacency. This is overconfidence from repeated experience performing a task. To combat that, avoid the tendency to see what you expect to see. So expect to find errors. Don't sign something if you didn't do it. Use checklists, hear it again, and learn from the mistakes of others. Number three, lack of knowledge, shortage of the training, information, and/or ability to successfully perform. To combat this, don't guess, know. Use manuals, ask when you don't know, and participate in training. Number four, distractions. Anything that draws your attention away from the task at hand. Distractions are the number one cause of forgetting things, including what has or has not been done in a maintenance task. So to combat that, get back in the groove after a distraction, use checklists, and go back 3 steps when we're starting your work. So don't just go back 1 step, go back 3. Number five, lack of teamwork. This is the failure to work together to complete a shared goal. To combat that, build solid teamwork, discuss how a task should be done, make sure everyone understands and agrees, and trust your teammates. Number six, fatigue. We're going to talk more about that in a few minutes, but that's the physical or mental exhaustion threatening work performance. To combat this, eliminate fatigue-related performance issues, watch for symptoms of fatigue in yourself and others, and have others check your work. Number seven, lack of resources. And this is not having enough people, equipment, documentation, time, parts, etc., to complete a task. To combat this, improve supply and support. Order supplies before they're required. Have a plan for pooling or loaning parts. Number eight, pressure. Real or perceived forces demanding high-level job performance. To combat this, reduce the burden of physical or mental distress. Communicate your concerns, ask for extra help, put safety first. Number nine, lack of assertiveness. Failure to speak up or document concerns about instructions, orders, or the actions of others. To combat this, express your feelings or opinions, beliefs, and needs in a positive, productive manner. This includes expressing concerns, but offering positive solutions, so not just criticizing, and resolve one issue before addressing another. Number 10, stress. We all have stress at certain times. Physical, chemical, or emotional factors that cause physical or mental tension. And to combat this, you're going to manage stress before it affects your work. So take a rational approach to problem solving, take a short break when needed, and discuss the problem with someone who can help. Number 11, lack of awareness, failure to recognize a situation, understand what it is, and predict the possible results. To combat this, see the whole picture. Make sure there are no conflicts with an existing repair or modifications. Fully understand the procedures needed to complete a task. And finally, number 12, expected norms, which are expected yet unwritten rules of behavior. To combat this, help maintain a positive environment with your good attitude and work habits. Existing norms don't make procedures right. Follow good safety procedures, identify and eliminate negative norms. So human-centric threats and errors. So we just talked about the dirty dozen and the errors and how you can prevent those, or how you can address a situation when it occurs. Maintaining a sterile cockpit, that's a crude flight concept, but it applies in the US environment as well. So when we're thinking about distractions, that concept of a sterile cockpit, it prohibits pilots from engaging in non-essential tasks or conversation during a critical phase of flight, whether it's takeoff, landing, hovering, basically anytime that there's a high task load or high risk event. So you want to watch for what I call looky-loos. They may approach your operational area, or they want to talk to you. As soon as they see a drone, they're like, "Hey, man, can I, have a conversation with you?" And even if you have a vest on that says "Do not distract," but as remote pilots, we're required to manage our flight area and manage those high task loads and be aware of what's going on, and what's happening with our auto flight systems, and know what's happening if you see something on your screen or you hear some sort of audible alert. So you want to be aware and be able to prevent those distractions that may occur. Continuing on, when you think about distractions, you also have to keep in mind boredom, and complacency leads to boredom. Often adequate training before flying an unfamiliar drone, we don't always think about that. We just think we're trained, we know how to fly. But if you have a drone that you haven't flown quite as much, or maybe your first time, it can be a little overconfident, you get bored, like, oh, I know how to do this. But you want to make sure that everything is set beforehand, and sure all your pre-flight tasks are done. And even if you're certified, making sure that you're experienced. So inexperienced pilots, they need some introductory training. So you don't want to be too proud to ask for that or to participate in training. Even crewed aircraft pilots should obtain training prior to flying a UAS, and then recognize the vulnerabilities of your UAS, whether that's wind, turbulence, weather conditions in general. You need to know how they impact your particular drone, whether that's fixed wing, multi-rotor, or some sort of hybrid. So some additional human-centric threats and errors include pilot interference. And crewed flight FARs approach interfering with crews pretty aggressively, and drones fall under Part 107. So it's also an aircraft, and it's flying in the national airspace. And in the sense of interfering with an aircraft in flight, even though there's not a physical pilot on the aircraft, that's still considered serious. And so when you think about, even if it's a situation with a law enforcement officer, and they come up, they see you flying the drone, they have questions, they want you to land the drone, you're trying to fly a mission, you might be near power lines, there could be other things you're keeping in mind, you're working for a customer. Is that interference considered legal under the FAA regulation? That's a really good question. And not to say that the law enforcement officer doesn't have valid questions or concern, but this would be a good place for a coworker, another pilot, visual observer, to have a conversation with a law enforcement officer, explain what's going on, the gravity of the situation. We need to complete this mission, and then we're going to land the aircraft, and then you can have a discussion. So getting that individual to understand that, look, this, we don't want to distract or interfere with the pilot in this situation. Very similar to a crewed aircraft. So to combat human-centric threats, their pilots have to consider a number of things. Four key components: time pressures, commercial pressures, personal pressures, and then PPE or personal protective equipment, and your pilot protection area, so that flight area. So time pressures can include anything from meeting schedules, responding back to a customer, late arrivals or departures of your crew, potentially that could slow down what you're trying to do, trying to beat the weather if you're seeing bad weather come in. And also there could be malfunctioning equipment, and being able to get that addressed in a timely way. Commercial pressure, so that is a myriad of things that could occur. The perception of a need to perform in a commercial space, competition. There's a lot of things going on, and you could have other pilots that are also out there competing with you, and you want to land that big one, that big job, that big customer. It could also be a lack of knowledge or unfamiliarity with a particular aircraft that may need to be flown for a particular job. And then, of course, in-flight obstacles. Personal pressures and include everything in our daily life as it is, and relationships. You could be trying to get recertified with your certification expiring, health and welfare, your family. How do you cope with all of those things? All of those things result in personal pressures. And then finally, personal protective equipment and the area you're going to be flying in. So that's the more day of, leading into the flight itself, cordoning off your flight area, make sure that you're familiar with where you're going to take off and land, that you feel comfortable, you've done some inspection of the area so you know what your hazards and your threats may be, that you have your crew ready, you've done a briefing of them. And then considering this photo that you see here, the drone pilot has on a hard hat. You could be on a construction site, and even as the drone pilot, they could ask you to wear a hard hat. If you know you're going to be flying there and you don't have it, that could delay and result back in a time pressure of not being able to fly because you don't have the right equipment. So thinking about what you're going to wear, you may need a safety vest. It could be required for the particular site that you're going to be flying when. So I said we'd talk more about fatigue and dehydration. The first noticeable effect of dehydration is actually fatigue. And that's when it makes that a turn towards making your top physical and mental performance difficult, if not downright impossible at times. So flying for long periods in the hot summer temperatures or even in high altitudes increases your susceptibility to dehydration, because the conditions tend to increase your rate of water loss from the body. Even high elevations do that, when you may not realize, like, gosh, I'm not sweating, but you're in Colorado and you're in high altitude, and that can also lead to water loss from the body. So to prevent dehydration, you should drink 2 to 4 quarts of water every 24 hours. You've probably heard of the 8 glasses. That's 8-ounce glasses of water. That's 64 total ounces, which is 2 quarts. And if the fluid isn't replaced, then the fatigue process sets in. So that's dizziness, weakness, nausea, tingling in the hands and feet, abdominal cramping, and extreme thirst. So each one of us, our physiological response is going to be different. And drinking 64 ounces of water, that's a guide recommendation. And the key component is for you to be aware of your own condition and impacts that the elements may have. Most people tend to become thirsty with 1.5 quart deficit from a hydration standpoint, which that's 2% of a loss of 2% of your total body weight. So this, when you get to the point of you're actually thirsty, that's too late. So the level of dehydration, it triggers what's called the thirst mechanism. And the problem with that is it's too late. So now it's told your brain you're thirsty, but now you're getting close to that dehydration point. So even a small amount of fluid that you may take in, you take a sip of water, it may turn off that initial thirst mechanism, like, okay, now I feel great, just had a cold sip of water, but it doesn't replace the actual body fluid. So you need to I always remind myself when I get to the point where I'm thirsty, it's not the point of no return, but now you've got some catching up to do. So just keep in mind that that thirst mechanism does lag behind our actual level of hydration. Alcohol and drugs are also important to be thinking about. UAS pilots are not immune to the crude pilot guidance for alcohol and drugs. So what you see here is information about different types of alcoholic beverages and the serving size, the alcohol content, what you may feel at different stages based on percentages of alcohol. UAS pilots still have to adhere to what's called the 8-hour bottle to throttle rule. So, you need to be beyond that time period. So you don't want to be at 4, 5, 6 hours, but it's 8 hours bottle to throttle, 8 hours or more. And you don't want to be at 8 hours in 1 minute. Never pilot under the influence. And when emergency occurs, it's likely, if there's a situation involving law enforcement, that you're going to need to submit to potentially an alcohol and or drug test. There can be impact prior to or during operations if you're impaired. So it's not just ahead of time with the flight, but during the flight and after as well. So drug and alcohol testing programs include awareness material from the FAA, and there's a lot of material. So FAR 120.225 extensively details how to initiate the drug and alcohol testing program. Let's talk about obstacles. As a UAS pilot, it is your responsibility to see and avoid any collisions with any obstacles in the vicinity of the operating area. You should always have visual line of sight of all relevant obstacles during your flight without use of a first-person camera. You can use a camera to enhance your spatial awareness, though. Some obstacles to consider and be on the lookout: buildings, towers, trees, power lines, bodies of water. And it's your responsibility to yield the right of way to other aircraft so that they don't have to take some sort of evasive action. So it is always your responsibility to yield. If you're a helicopter, see a helicopter, make sure you know your surroundings. That's why it's important to use visual observers as well. And you must yield the right of way. You can do a great deal with tools that we've talked about. So use the tools that are available to you. Some of these include your senses, knowing your aircraft, using your aircraft application like you see here on the screen, using your visual observers or ground crew weather apps before you fly, so you know if there is impending weather potentially, and then of course checklists. So spatial awareness and disorientation, those two components, they sadly go hand in hand. So spatial awareness is maintaining that spatial awareness so that you can avoid obstacles in your operating area. And this means always being aware of your aircraft's position, orientation, and motion relative to you as the pilot and obstacles in the vicinity. Spatial disorientation, on the other hand, is the failure to maintain spatial awareness throughout the flight, which can then lead to a collision. There are 2 resources in the instructional materials section of this module that you can review on your own. There are 3 types of spatial disorientation. Type 1 is unrecognized, so that's where the pilot doesn't consciously perceive any manifestation of any spatial disorientation, so just unaware, unrecognized. And this most likely is going to lead to controlled flight into an obstacle or terrain. So didn't realize how close you were to the tree until you hit the tree. Type 2 is recognized, and this is where the pilot consciously perceives a manifestation of spatial disorientation, but doesn't attribute it to spatial disorientation itself. Instrument malfunction is often suspected, so it's like, oh, there must be something causing this problem beyond just it's spatial disorientation. And then type number 3 is incapacitating. So this is where the pilot is aware of some sort of conflict between internal perceptions and the aircraft instruments, but is physically incapable of making required control inputs to correct the problem. So now we've realized it's there, there's some sort of conflict, but just I'm not going to be able to get myself out of that. So to prevent disorientation, you can do a number of things. The best way, of course, to avoid the consequences of disorientation is by preventing disorientation from occurring in the first place. Being educated about disorientation and what that is, so you can better avoid it from happening to you. And it's important to never lose focus during a flight to avoid disorientation. So, hang in there and keep working through your checklist. If you have a visual observer there, if you have other crew, getting them to also be aware of what's going on. So don't hide that to yourself as a pilot, but ask for some help, because it could be that your visual observer, they know exactly where the aircraft is. You're just disoriented. You can also practice with experiencing spatial disorientation by using a flight simulator, like you see here as just one example. And this will give you some experience with disorientation that won't cause negative consequences of crashing an aircraft. So finally, in summary, practice ways to mitigate the dirty dozen that we learned about at the very beginning. It's your responsibility to see and avoid any obstacles that could affect your flight. Work to combat those human-centric threats. Maintain situational awareness. Spatial disorientation is the failure to maintain spatial awareness throughout the duration of the flight. And there are 3 types of spatial disorientation: unrecognized, recognized, and incapacitating. Okay. That concludes this module. Now let's jump into the knowledge check questions. Good luck.